Hello, welcome to our lecture on experience in Ignatian Pedagogy. And this lecture is called Building Empowerment Through Experience. You will recall that when we talked about the Ignatian classroom and we talked about the three relationships in the classroom among the teacher, the learner, and the world, one of these relationships, one of the more obvious ones, is the relationship between the learner and the teacher. And we've already discussed quite substantially how this relationship should be characterized by empathy. And we do this by paying attention to context in Ignatian pedagogy. Now we're going to focus our attention on empowerment and how experience in Ignatian pedagogy can help us build empowerment. You must be familiar with this diagram by now. It's the usual diagram we use for Ignatian pedagogy, where you have the cycle of experience, reflection, and action. Now, you may be wondering, why did we talk about reflection and action first? Why did we wait until now before we began to talk about experience? Usually, experience is the first thing that people talk about when they discuss Ignatian pedagogy. Well, that choice, that decision has to do with the backward design. In backward design, we move up assessment. We think about assessment first. We design our assessment first before we bother with the learning experiences. And the reason for that is that we want to make sure that our assessments are aligned to our desired learning outcomes, which should include the insights we've formulated as well as the action goals. At the same time, our assessments will also shape the kind of learning experiences, the content and student tasks that we will prepare for our students. So, when you think about it, before we even bother with experience, before we even design experience, there are three prior design questions that we need to ask, that we need to take into consideration. And these questions, actually, we've been discussing when we talked about context, reflection, and action. What are these questions? The first question in context, there's a whole set of questions here. First, what prior knowledge do the learners need before we even plunge into this new topic? Second, what is their prevailing mood? Because their mood will affect how they learn or whether they learn at all. What are their shared interests so that I can come up with a hook that will be successful, that will get to engage them? And finally, how do the learners prefer to learn? Do they have a particular learning preference that I can maximize during my class? So this is the first set of questions, and they all are related to context. The second question is really about reflection. What insights do we want learners to glean from the class? Remember, we said we need to formulate the insights ahead of time, as well as the reflection questions that we're going to ask to encourage our students to reflect in the proper direction. Of course, as we said, there's no guarantee that they will come up with exactly the same insight, but it's important for the teacher to prepare so that reflection will happen. And finally, the last question, the last design question we need to consider before we even think about experience is, how do we want learners to apply what they have learned? So what transfer of learning do we want our students to be capable of and that we want them to be able to achieve? So by just considering these design questions prior to learning, the teacher is already assuming the two recommended roles as far as reflection is concerned. The teacher is already taking on the role of a facilitator of reflection by making sure that reflection has been prepared for, the insights and reflection questions have been formulated, because this is the only way that the teacher can use to coax the learner to become a meaning maker. Secondly, by formulating action goals, the teacher is already taking on the role of the coach of action, the other recommended role in Ignatian pedagogy. So the hope here is that the learners will take their cue from their teacher and assume the role of creator to become active users and creators of knowledge. Now we're focusing on experience. We want the teacher to become a designer not only of learning experiences, but also of learning environments. The hope is that the learners will become inquirers. We've already said that we want learning in the Ignatian classroom to be reflection-driven as well as action-oriented. But refractive learning isn't just reflection-driven, it's not just action-oriented. It is also, and more fundamentally, learner-centered. And this is why the role of the teacher as a designer of learning experiences and environments is very crucial. Let's go back to that document called Ignatian Pedagogy, a Practical Approach, and look at how experience is defined there. And here I quote, "The involvement of the whole person, mind, heart, and will, is captured in what experience means for Ignatius of Loyola." There are a couple more quotes I'd like us to discuss because I think they're important. This is the first one. "Thus, we use the term experience to describe any activity in which, in addition to a cognitive grasp of the matter being considered, some sensation of an affective nature is registered by the student." So the point here, the big idea here, is that experience should not be reduced to only a cognitive experience. It's not only an intellectual activity, because that's usually the default. Very explicitly, we are told to pay attention to the sensation of an affective nature. Now, if you're familiar with Ignatian spirituality, this is very much in sync with Ignatian spirituality. Ignatian contemplation isn't just intellectual meditation. It's about experiencing the Word of God in an affective way. So you can see how Ignatian pedagogy is really rooted in Ignatian spirituality, particularly the spiritual exercises. Because the definition of experience is similar. It's not just intellectual, but it includes what's affective. So a learning experience in Ignatian pedagogy is more than cognitive. Here's a second quote. "Human experience may be either direct or vicarious. Direct experience in an academic setting usually occurs in interpersonal experiences such as conversations or discussions, laboratory investigations, field trips, service projects, participation in sports, and the like." So the emphasis here is the interpersonal nature of experience. This is also very important in Ignatian pedagogy. And finally, learning is often achieved through vicarious experiences in reading or listening to a lecture. In order to involve students in the learning experience more fully at a human level, teachers are challenged to stimulate student imagination and use of the senses, precisely so that students can enter the reality studied more fully. So experience in Ignatian pedagogy should not just be more than cognitive. It should not just be interpersonal, but more than anything else, it should be holistic, involving the use of several senses and even the imagination. So one way we can summarize what experience means in the IPP is that it is what students are led to experience, not just intellectually, in order to engage them and to educate them. Now, this calls to mind what we talked about previously about active interactive learning. We made a distinction between the one-way teacher-centered approach, the broadcast approach on the one hand, and on the other, the two-way learner-centered approach. And we said that this learner-centered approach must be active and interactive. So experience in refractive learning should be holistic. It should be designed to be active and interactive. And what do we want our students to do? Why are we designing the experience to be holistic and to be active and interactive? We want them to be attentive to experience. We are now going back to Lonergan's transcendental precept, the first of his 4 precepts, to be attentive to experience. When we pray in the Ignatian way, we're invited to savor the experience. In the same way, the learner is being invited to savor the learning experience. So it is only when learners pay attention to their experience, only when they try to savor their experience, can they learn. So the job of the teacher as designer is to design empowering experiences, empowering learning experiences. And to be able to understand what that means, it might be good to recall this diagram which we've already encountered previously, when we talked about the difference between the comfort zone and the safety zone. Both of them are not yet in the danger zone, but there's this blue area beyond the comfort zone, which is called the safety zone. We can also call this the stretch zone. because this is where we stretch ourselves, we ventured out of our comfort zone, we are not yet in the danger zone, but we are learning and we are growing. And this is the area where we want to invite our students to go when we design empowering learning experiences. If you only keep your students in their comfort zone, that would not be a very empowering experience. They will not feel the challenge to grow and to learn. So, what we want to happen is to come up with learning experiences that will stretch the thinking of our students as well as their ability. Now, before we talk about designing learning experiences, let's focus our attention first on the condition for the possibility of empowering learning experiences. And I'm referring to empowering learning environments. What kind of environments will be conducive to empowering learning experiences? And to understand this, it will be helpful to turn to David Thornburg, who has this framework which he calls 4 learning spaces. We've adapted it a little bit to suit learning by refraction, but basically the inspiration comes from David Thornburg. According to him, and let me quote, learners have long gathered around campfires, watering holes, and have isolated themselves in the seclusion of caves and gone out on hunting expeditions. Let's stop here for a while. What David Thornburg has done here is he has just enumerated what he calls the 4 learning spaces: campfires, watering holes, caves, and hunting expeditions. We'll come up with our own versions later and discuss them. But for now, let's go on. These learners have experienced all these learning environments in balance. And if the balance is offset, learning suffers. So here Thornburg draws our attention to the need for balance of the different learning spaces. Let's discuss each of the different learning spaces. The first one is the campfire. This is the most common and most familiar. It's probably the default learning space that we teachers use all the time. Campfire is the learning space when students learn from experts. In the proverbial campfire, villagers sit around a fire and listen to the expert in the village, who is, of course, the elder. Now, this is the default setup in most classrooms. This is the traditional arrangement where the students are seated to listen to direct instruction from the teacher. Now, the campfire is a valuable learning space. It's a very efficient learning space because lectures are a great way to learn, but by no means is it the only space. By no means is it the only kind of learning environment that we can offer our students. So now we're being asked to consider the other learning spaces. The second learning space would be the cafe. Now, the cafe is a great metaphor because when we go to a cafe, we basically chat with our friends, we exchange ideas, both serious and not serious. Cafe refers to the learning environment where students are encouraged to learn from their peers. So here we're talking about group discussions and other group activities in which peers can learn from one another. Now, research has shown time and again how learning with your peers can be a very powerful experience for our students. Many times they actually prefer to learn from their peers, probably because it's more fun and they're all on the same level. So the second learning environment is the cafe, where students are encouraged to learn from one another and to help one another. The third one is the cave. This is where the student pauses and puts things together and tries to create some meaning. There are actually many ways of creating this learning environment of the cave in our classrooms. We could just ask our students to engage in some think time. So a lecture can be chunked up, and between these chunks, we can ask our students to just think about a couple of questions, or we can ask them to write a journal, write a reflection paper. All of this is really learning from the self. So the third kind of learning space is called the cave, and this is where we encourage our students to learn by themselves and to learn from themselves. The final learning environment is the community. We're calling it community because we would like our students to learn by serving the world, by serving society in some way. So here we're already challenging our students not only to use what they've learned in the real world, but to actually to use it in such a way that it'll benefit some people, some community, if that's possible. So The community is probably the most challenging learning environment to set up, but it's worth considering. After all, we are not being asked to have all the four learning spaces all the time. What's important here is flexibility. We should not be stuck with designing the campfire all the time because that's what we're most familiar with. The basis for our decisions as to what kind of learning space we should offer our students should be what will be most effective in promoting learning given the topic and given the learning outcomes that we have. So the question is, how do we increase our repertoire of teaching practices so that teaching by telling or campfire is not the only way our students learn in our classes? How can we design our classes to include other learning spaces when they are suitable and when they are desirable? Now, I get it, lectures continue to be valuable. There must always be a place for lectures in our classes. But we mustn't be stuck with only delivering lectures, and our students shouldn't be stuck with only listening to our lectures because lectures are not always the most effective way for learning. Somebody once quipped that lectures are the most efficient way to transfer the notes of the teacher to the students' notes without passing through either of their minds. Now, that's obviously an exaggeration, it's obviously hyperbole, but I think it makes the point that lectures can be quite ineffective sometimes. So it's important for us to widen our repertoire of teaching practices so that it is not limited to teaching by telling or to what we call campfire. So we've talked about the four learning spaces. It's important for us to be flexible. It's important for us to be able to offer one or two learning environments that are going to best promote learning given our topic and given our students. Let's now move on to learning experiences. How can we design empowering learning experiences? Now, there are many ways to talk about this, but one simple way I think that's been very practical and helpful is to use what we call the 5 eighths of learning. We call it the 5 eighths because the five verbs here, the five criteria here, the five indicators here all end with eight. Investigate, collaborate, communicate, create, and contemplate. So the 5 eighths of learning really operationalize what the students should be experiencing, what they should be doing. When we talk about learning experiences in refractive learning, in Ignatian Pedagogy, they must be active verbs. Verbs like investigate, collaborate, communicate, create, and contemplate. As long as our learners are engaging in any one of these 5 eighths, then the learning experience is probably effective in facilitating learning. Let's go to the first one, investigate. Investigate basically is we want our students to pursue knowledge independently. We don't want to spoon feed our students with knowledge. So the student does not just wait and assimilate content. They don't just sit there listening to our lectures, waiting in order to assimilate the content. Rather, we're asking them to actively locate content and to critically interrogate content to check whether it is accurate and useful. That's why the verb we picked is investigate, to locate as well as to evaluate. The second eighth is to contemplate. We want our students to reflect about the meaning of what they have learned. In other words, we want them to engage in reflection. So here we see the overlap between experience and reflection. So the student is given the opportunity to make meaning and make connections to other knowledge and experiences. So the student asks the questions, what have I learned? How have I learned it? Why are we learning it? Do the questions sound familiar to you? These are the levels of reflection, the conceptual level of reflection, the metacognitive level of reflection, and the personal level of reflection. So we want our students to contemplate, to reflect, and to connect. The third eighth is create. We want our students to apply the new learning in a way that shows mastery and understanding. So this one overlaps with action. We want our students to already engage in transfer of learning in a way that's informed by their understanding. Remember that definition of action as the wise use of content in context? This is what Create is all about. We want them to already engage in transfer of learning. So for them to do that, our students must design a product, performance, or solution that is valued in the given discipline and that not only demonstrates learning but also enhances learning. So create a product, a performance, or engage in problem solving. The next eight is collaborate. We want our students to collaborate. So as you can see, the five eights are also the 21st century success skills that educators keep talking about. We want our students to learn to work together, whether face-to-face or virtually, on a common project. We want them to collaborate to achieve a common goal. They must learn how to cooperate, how to negotiate. This is a 21st century real world skill. So we want them to be able to rehearse how to collaborate with our students in our classes. So when we design a learning experience that enables them to collaborate with one another, that's actually a very valuable experience for them. And finally, the final eight is to communicate. We want our students to share what they have learned and make some difference if that's possible. So usually, the only public, the only audience that students have when they communicate their learning is a teacher. But now we're asking them to share their insights or their findings with different audiences. And because they're addressing different audiences, they must think of novel, fresh, original, and effective ways of doing that. So when we ask them to communicate, we want them to publish and share what they have learned. We don't want them to communicate what they've learned only to an audience of one, the teacher. First of all, that's not going to appeal to them. If we enable them to communicate what they've learned to a larger public, to publish as well as to share beyond the teacher, I think it's an effective way of encouraging them to do a better job. So here we have the five eights: investigate, contemplate, create, collaborate, communicate. There's a whole world of possibilities today, especially because of technology. Technology widens the possibilities of the five eights. Technology also widens the possibilities of the learning spaces. Let's take investigate. When I was a student, I had to trudge to the library and literally go to the bookshelves to look for the books and references that I will use to be able to do research. Today, everything's just a click away. There's so much information available today, as we've discussed previously. What's important now is that the students are able to choose which of these pieces of information are accurate and reliable. And that's a great exercise for them to investigate. They locate the content and they also evaluate the content by interrogating the content. So the teacher need not be the sage on the stage. The teacher need not be the exclusive source of information anymore. We can actually send off our students to do the investigation on their own. So much possibility out there. Let's look at collaborate. Collaborate is also so promising today. You don't need to collaborate with your classmates. You can actually collaborate with your peers from other countries, from other parts of the world. And that really adds a new dimension because the students also learn what it means to be a global citizen, what it means to live in an intercultural world, and what it means to work with people from other cultures who may be different from us. So thanks to technology, there's now a whole universe of possibilities when it comes to designing learning environments as well as learning experiences. Now, learning by refraction, we said, has three characteristics. It must be learner-centered, it must be reflection-driven, and it must be action-oriented. And in order to promote these three qualities of refractive learning, it's important for the teacher to assume the role of designer, facilitator, and coach. Let's go through each one of these. For learning to be learner-centered, it is important that the teacher designs the learning environments and experiences in such a way that it is the learner who is doing most of the work and the thinking and the learning instead of the teacher. In the traditional and stereotypical classroom, it is the teacher who is doing most of the work and the thinking because the default learning space is the campfire and the students are not engaging in any of the five eights. So it's a teacher who ends up doing most of the learning, ironically. For refractive learning to be reflection driven, the teacher must facilitate the learning in such a way that it is the learner's understanding, the connections that he or she makes, that is directing the learning. Usually, our classrooms are textbook driven and not reflection driven. So we have to move away from the textbook driven character of our classes to make them more reflection driven. For refractive learning to be action oriented, the teacher must assume the role of coach of action so that it is the learner's application of what has been learned to the real world that matters and not just the text. Usually, our classes are only test oriented. Everything stops with the exam. We are being challenged to level up a little bit and aim so that our class will become action oriented, so that learners will actually apply what they have learned in the real world. Let's go back to Lonergan's transcendental precepts. If learning by refraction is about students experiencing, students reflecting, and students taking action, it's important to recall the four commandments, as it were, from Lonergan. We must design the experience so that our students will learn to be attentive to their experience. This is especially important today when all of us seem to have a distraction disorder thanks to technology. How can we teach our students to be more attentive to the learning experiences that we design for them? Secondly, how can we facilitate reflection in such a way that our students will learn to become intelligent as well as reasonable? We want them to understand, but we also want them to make the judgment whether their understanding is correct, whether what they say is true or not. And finally, we want our students to be responsible. We want them to make responsible decisions and take responsible courses of action based on what they have experienced, based on what they have learned. Being attentive to our experience is a rare thing today because of technology and the frantic lifestyle that all of us seem to be leading. Being intelligent and being reasonable are like defying gravity because of the default tendency to skim through things and not engage in critical thinking. And finally, it's not exactly in fashion to be responsible and accountable for our decisions and actions. So at the end of the day, in light of Lonergan's transcendental precepts, learning by refraction, which is based on Ignatian pedagogy, is really about the formation of our students into attentive, intelligent, reasonable, and responsible human beings. So this talk is about building empowerment through experience. I hope through this talk we got a better appreciation of what experience means in Ignatian pedagogy and how experience can build empowerment among our students by focusing on the role of the teacher as a designer not only of learning experiences but also learning environments.